Hello, you're watching Addleshaw Goddard's Employment Channel. Today we're looking at proposed reforms relating to executive pay, and more specifically exit payments made to directors of listed companies, which were recently announced by the Business Secretary Vince Cable. Following the consultation paper on enhancing shareholders' voting rights on executive pay, which was issued by the Department for Business Innovation and Skills in March 2012, the final proposed reforms have now been published as part of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill, which we mentioned in our news programme on 13th of July. It's proposed that these reforms will come into effect for quoted companies with financial years ending after 31st of October 2013. Michael Carter, head of the Employee Incentives Group here at Addleshaw Goddard, is going to talk us through the main reforms in more detail.
These are wide-ranging reforms, particularly on how pay is disclosed and what rights shareholders have to vote on executive pay. Today I want to highlight 4 key areas. The first is that there will be a binding vote on future pay unless it is unchanged. A company will therefore be required to put its proposed pay policy for the next year to an annual binding vote unless the policy remains unchanged from the previous year. If the pay policy remains unchanged, it need only be put to shareholders every 3 years. The aim of this change is to encourage companies to devise a pay policy for the long term. The government considers this will put a downward pressure on the ratcheting of pay. I think we'll wait and see on that one. So what do companies need to put in their pay policy report? The report needs to be comprehensive and must include the following elements. Perhaps the most important is that there will be a table which needs to set out the key elements of pay and states how each element supports the company's strategy, how it will operate, whether there will be clawback and malus, the maximum potential value, the performance metrics, and an explanation of any changes. The consultation document issued with the regulations gives an example of what the table should look like, and it will be fairly prescriptive. You'll also need to set out information on employment contracts. In particular, existing contractual provisions that relate to directors' pay and/or termination payments, scenarios for what directors will get paid for performance that is above, on or below target, implementation on the percentage change in profit, dividends and the overall spend on pay, the principles on which exit payments will be made, including how they will be calculated, whether the company distinguishes between different types of levers, and how performance will be taken into account, and I'm going to talk about that a little later, and material factors that have been taken into account when setting the pay policy, especially employee pay and shareholders' views. This will also include the percentage increase in pay for the CEO compared to the workforce generally. The second area I want to highlight is that shareholders' votes on pay will not require a supermajority for a vote to be passed. A supermajority was originally suggested in the consultation document. However, I'm glad to say it has been confirmed that both the binding vote on future pay and the advisory vote on the implementation of that policy over the last financial year will require only a simple majority to be passed, i.e. an ordinary resolution. However, the Financial Reporting Council has been asked by the government to consult on potential changes to the Corporate Governance Code to require a company to publish a statement stating what they will do to address shareholder concerns where there is a substantial majority of shareholders that have voted against the company's future pay policy and/or its implementation. The government considers that this will hold directors publicly to account. Turning to the third area I wanted to highlight, the current advisory vote on the implementation of the pay policy is to remain, but it will have a sting in the tail. Now, if the company fails the advisory vote, it will be required to put its overall pay policy back to shareholders for reapproval in a binding vote the following year. So what needs to go into the implementation report? Well, the most important new element is that there must be a single total pay figure for each director. The regulations set out a prescribed table format for disclosure. Emphasis is on the figure being comprehensive, consistent and reflecting pay earned rather than the potential pay awarded. Details of performance against metrics for long-term incentives, total pension entitlement, exit payments made in the year, again I will say more on this later, total shareholdings of directors, interestingly a chart comparing company performance and CEO pay over the previous 10 years, information about who has advised the Remuneration Committee, and also putting it into the shareholder context. The final area I wanted to highlight, and perhaps the most important area for yourselves, is that there will be a requirement to disclose potential and actual exit payments, but there will be no binding vote on such payments made in excess of 12 months' salary, as had been originally suggested in the proposals. As I mentioned, a company will be required, as part of its pay policy, to disclose the principles on which exit payments to directors will be made, including how they will be calculated, whether the company distinguishes between good leavers and bad leavers, and how performance will be taken into account. Payments on termination must either be consistent with the pay policy agreed with shareholders or must be specifically approved by shareholders. The effect of the legislation will be that any obligation to make a non-compliant payment entered into with the directors will not be enforceable, and that if any payment is made that is not compliant with that policy, whether on termination or otherwise, the new regime provides for it to be held in trust for the company or other specified party. Furthermore, the directors who authorise a non-compliant payment are jointly and severally liable to indemnify the paying company for any loss arising. However, there is a caveat to this. Payments required to be made under contracts entered into before the 27th of June 2012 will be outside of the statutory trust provisions I've just outlined, unless the contract is modified or renewed on or after the 27th of June 2012. In addition to being bound by its stated pay policy, a company will be required to publish a statement promptly following termination, setting out exactly what the departing director has received, as well as restating this information in the annual report and accounts. The statement must set out the level of compensation, broken down into its key elements, an explanation of how each element was calculated, and an explanation of how the decisions made relate to the policy on exit payments. This gives the Remuneration Committee flexibility to deal with termination on a case-by-case basis by, for example, the use of discretion in bonus or share plan rules, whilst at the same time giving transparency to the potential amounts that could be paid in the pay policy report and promptly reporting the amounts that are actually paid. In conclusion, although the proposals are in some areas at least less stringent than those set out in the original consultation paper, they do represent a significant change to the reporting regime and will mean a lot of additional work for companies. As Helen mentioned, they will apply to financial years ending on or after 31st of October 2013. The changes are being implemented via the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, and new remuneration report regulations, which will be adopted as a statutory instrument under existing powers. Consultation on the draft regulations is currently ongoing and remains open until the 26th of September 2012.
Thanks, Michael. So that's all for today from Addleshaw Goddard's Employment Channel. Thank you for watching and goodbye.